Hey guys, a medieval kitchen might sound almost comforting at first. Warm bread, a crackling fire, the smell of herbs hanging from dark wooden beams. But for most people, the reality was far less romantic. It was one of the hottest, dirtiest, and most exhausting places in daily life. A room built around smoke, ash, labor, and constant risk. Before we settle into it, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight and what piece of history you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoy thoughtful, long-form history like this, a quiet like on the video really helps support the channel. And if you'd like more calm journeys into the strange realities of the past, subscribing is a simple way to stay connected. Now, let's step into the kitchen. Not the imagined medieval kitchen of paintings and festivals, but the real one, where most people worked, sweated, and spent a remarkable amount of their lives. One of the easiest mistakes modern viewers make is to imagine the medieval kitchen as simply an older version of our own. A place for recipes, meals, and perhaps a little inconvenience. But the medieval kitchen was not a separate convenience attached to life. In many homes, it was life. It was where warmth came from, where water was heated, where animals were prepared, where bread was baked, where servants spent long hours, where smoke gathered in the rafters, and where danger never fully left the room. To understand the medieval household, especially outside the wealthiest noble estates, you have to begin with fire. Fire was not optional. It was survival. In a world without electric stoves, gas ranges, central heating, refrigeration, or reliable lighting, the hearth was the center of domestic existence. It cooked food, warmed bodies, dried clothes, heated bathwater, when bathing happened at all, and offered the only dependable indoor light after sunset. But keeping a fire alive was work. It had to be fed constantly with wood, peat, charcoal, or whatever fuel the household could afford. In poorer rural homes, gathering fuel could take hours of physical labor. Wood was heavy. Forests were often controlled by lords or common rights, and fuel shortages could shape an entire winter. A kitchen fire was not something you simply switched on for dinner. It was a managed, living thing. People often banked embers overnight beneath ash, so the morning fire could be revived without starting from nothing. Losing the household fire completely could be a serious inconvenience, even a quiet domestic crisis. Restarting it meant time, effort, and sometimes borrowing flame from a neighbor. And once the fire was burning, it brought another problem: smoke. Many early medieval homes had no proper chimney at all. Smoke simply rose upward toward a hole in the roof or toward whatever gap it could find. Even in better-built homes, ventilation was limited. Kitchens could become thick with it, with smoke clinging to clothes, eyes watering, lungs irritated. The romantic image of sunlight through old timber beams misses one important detail. Those beams were often blackened by years of soot. Walls absorbed it, ceilings held it, clothing carried it. People lived inside smoke. This was especially true for women, servants, and kitchen workers who spent long hours close to the hearth. Modern historians looking at household labor often point out that the health burden of smoke exposure was not a small side note. It was daily, intimate, and relentless, and the heat itself could be brutal. Large kitchens in monasteries, castles, and manor houses were designed around enormous open hearths capable of feeding dozens or even hundreds of people. Roasting spits turned over flames for hours. Massive cauldrons boiled soups, pottages, and stews. Ovens radiated stored heat long after bread had gone in. In summer, especially, these spaces could feel punishing. Imagine standing for hours in wool clothing, near open flame, lifting heavy iron pots, hauling water, chopping roots, plucking birds, salting meat, and scrubbing wooden surfaces with no modern ventilation and very little relief. The phrase "working in the kitchen" barely captures it. It was heat as environment. And unlike the polished kitchen culture of later centuries, medieval cooking was deeply physical. It involved lifting, carrying, grinding, kneading, butchering, preserving, cleaning, and repairing. Even preparing a relatively ordinary meal demanded labor before the actual cooking began. Grain had to be milled, water had to be fetched, herbs had to be gathered, fuel had to be cut. Meat, if there was meat, had to be dressed and preserved quickly. Freshness was not a supermarket concept. It was a race against spoilage. Without refrigeration, households depended on salt, smoke, drying, pickling, and careful timing. Food preservation was not a hobby. It was what stood between survival and hunger. A chicken killed too late in warm weather could become dangerous. Fish had to be eaten quickly inland. Milk turned fast. Bread molded. Ale soured. Kitchen knowledge was practical intelligence, and mistakes had consequences. This is also where class becomes important. The medieval kitchen of a peasant cottage and the kitchen of a noble household were not the same world, even if both revolved around fire. In a poor village home, the kitchen might simply be part of the main living space itself. One central hearth, one smoky room, one family sharing warmth with tools, animals, and daily life pressed close together. Cooking was basic, repetitive, and shaped almost entirely by necessity. Pottage, thick, slow-cooked stew was common because it made sense. It could stretch ingredients, soften coarse grains, and keep simmering over time. Bread, onions, cabbage, leeks, beans, oats. These were ordinary realities, not charming rustic symbols. Luxury was not flavor. Luxury was reliability. In a great manor or castle, however, kitchens became systems. There were separate rooms for baking, brewing, butchering, scullery work, and storage. Servants operated within hierarchies. A cook in a noble household was not simply preparing food. He or she was managing status. Feasts were political performances. The food itself signaled wealth and control. Imported spices, white bread, elaborate pies, sugar sculptures in later periods, these were messages as much as meals. A lord's table had to demonstrate abundance, even when the land around him might be struggling. And yet, even here, beneath the performance, the labor remained harsh. Someone had to pluck the geese. Someone had to scrub the grease. Someone had to carry water up stone corridors in winter. The elegance arrived only at the table. The kitchen behind it was still hot, loud, and physically unforgiving. There was also the problem of cleanliness, or rather, the modern misunderstanding of it. People often assume medieval kitchens were dirty because medieval people simply did not care about hygiene. That is too simple and usually unfair. They did care, but cleanliness existed inside different limits. Hot water was labor. Soap was not casually abundant. Surfaces were wood, stone, iron, and cloth, all harder to sanitize by modern standards. Animals were closer to domestic life. Flies were constant. Storage was vulnerable. Rats were a real and persistent enemy. You could care deeply about cleanliness and still live in conditions that made perfect cleanliness impossible. Kitchen staffs fought contamination with salt, vinegar, ash, boiling water, and routine habits. They swept rushes, scrubbed boards, covered food where possible, and watched carefully for spoilage. But no one was operating with modern germ theory. They understood rot, smell, corruption, and sickness through observation, not microbiology. They knew bad food could make people ill, even if they explained the reason differently. In that sense, the kitchen was a place of practical knowledge passed through repetition rather than formal science. Cook knew by smell, by color, by texture, by instinct learned over years, and often by fear, because kitchens were dangerous in ways we rarely think about now. Burns were common. Serious burns could change or end a working life. Open flames near fabric and straw created constant fire risk. Sharp knives, heavy iron hooks, unstable boiling pots. All of it lived inside ordinary work. Entire towns feared kitchen fires because one accident could spread quickly through timber buildings and tightly packed streets. A forgotten ember was not a minor mistake. Could become disaster. This is one reason many larger medieval kitchens were built slightly apart from main halls, especially in noble houses and monasteries. Separation reduced the chance that a cooking fire would consume the entire residence. It also reduced smoke drifting into elite living spaces. Even architecture quietly admitted the truth. Kitchens were necessary, but they were not comfortable places to be. And perhaps that is the deeper reality modern audiences often miss. The medieval kitchen was not the cozy heart of the home in the sentimental sense. It was the engine room of survival. Warmth came from labor. Meals came from labor. Safety came from labor. Someone was always working to keep ordinary life possible. That labor was often invisible in the grander stories of kings, wars, and cathedrals. But history lives there too, in the person turning bread dough before dawn, in the servant carrying ashes out to the yard, in the cook trying to stretch winter stores just a little further before spring. The kingdom might be discussed in the hall, but it was sustained in the kitchen. And once we begin looking there, another question quietly appears. If the kitchen was the center of survival, then who controlled it, and who was expected to disappear inside it? And that question leads directly into one of the most revealing truths about the medieval kitchen. It was not simply a place, but a social order. Who worked there, who gave instructions there, who ate first and who ate last, these details could tell you almost everything about a household. In smaller peasant homes, the division was less formal but no less real. Women were usually expected to carry the primary burden of domestic cooking, alongside childcare, washing, spinning, mending, gardening, and often agricultural labor as well. The kitchen was not their only responsibility. It was simply woven into all the others. There was no clean separation between household work and field work. A woman might rise before dawn to relight the hearth, prepare coarse bread or porridge, tend animals, carry water, and still spend much of the day in outdoor labor before returning to prepare the evening meal. The rhythm was constant, and because so much of this work happened inside ordinary repetition, it often disappeared from formal records. Chronicles described battles and inheritances. Tax rolls counted land and livestock. Very few documents paused to describe the person standing over the pot every day, making sure everyone else could continue. Yet that person was holding the household together. Even in noble households, where there were ranks of servants, the kitchen remained deeply structured by hierarchy. A grand estate might employ a master cook, assistant cooks, bakers, brewers, spit-turners, scullions, dairy workers, and young kitchen boys assigned the least desirable tasks. The scullery was often the harshest beginning. This was where pots were scrubbed, scraps were cleared, greasy trenchers were cleaned, and the endless wet labor of kitchen maintenance happened. It was hot, damp, repetitive, and exhausting. Young servants often entered domestic service here, learning quickly that noble feasts looked very different from below stairs. The phrase "below stairs" matters.it reminds us that medieval households were built around visibility and invisibility. The lord and guests saw polished platters and orderly service. They did not see the smoke, the burns, the shouted instructions, the hands stained with fish scales and ash. Good service meant making labor disappear, and kitchens were full of sounds rarely preserved in paintings. The scrape of knives, the thud of cleavers, the crack of bones, the turning of spits, the barking of dogs waiting for scraps, the arguments over timing, the constant requests from halls expecting food to appear at exactly the right moment. Silence was not part of the working kitchen. Neither was privacy. Servants worked in close proximity, often under supervision, often under pressure. Mistakes could be expensive. Food waste mattered. A spoiled roast for an ordinary family was a loss. A ruined feast for a noble household could be embarrassment, punishment, or worse. This pressure increased dramatically on religious feast days, weddings, political visits, and winter celebrations. A lord entertaining guests was performing power. The kitchen had to support that performance. Entire oxen might be roasted. Fish for fasting days had to be prepared in great quantities. Pies became architectural constructions, sometimes designed as much for display as for eating. Imported spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, were used not because medieval people were trying to hide rotten meat, as the old myth often claims, but because these ingredients were expensive and prestigious. To serve them was to display access. Pepper was not just flavor, it was status. This is another place where modern assumptions flatten the truth. Medieval food was not simply bland peasant stew versus extravagant noble feasts. It was shaped by religion, season, geography, and economics. The Christian calendar alone transformed kitchen life. There were many fasting days throughout the year, especially for the wealthy and the observant. During these periods, meat from four-legged animals was restricted, and fish became central. This created enormous logistical demands, especially inland. Salted herring, preserved cod, freshwater fish from managed ponds. These were not minor menu adjustments. They were part of a vast system of trade and planning. Monasteries became particularly skilled at this. Their kitchens often ran with remarkable discipline, feeding large religious communities while following strict dietary rules. Fish ponds were carefully maintained. Bread production was organized. Brewing was often substantial. The monastery kitchen was not only spiritual support, it was institutional management. Again, the kitchen reveals the system. Even kings were dependent on cooks. A royal court moved with astonishing appetite. Feeding a traveling household required planning on a scale difficult to imagine now. Grain, wine, meat, candles, salt, servants, transport animals. Every stop on the journey meant negotiation and preparation. Royal kitchens were administrative machines. And yet, despite all the structure, the basic vulnerability remained the same as in the poorest cottage. If the food failed, everything else failed with it. Hunger sits very close to medieval history. Bad harvests did not mean inconvenience. They meant fear. A wet summer, a failed grain crop, a disease among livestock. These could transform the kitchen from a place of labor into a place of rationing. Meals became thinner. Bread changed quality. Ale weakened. Meat disappeared. Families measured time not by comfort, but by whether the stores might last until spring. The famous medieval obsession with bread makes more sense when seen this way. Bread was not a side dish. It was structure. Its absence changed everything. People judged prosperity through grain. Lords were expected to maintain order partly because they were expected to protect food systems. Bread riots in later centuries were not irrational anger. They were political statements about survival. The kitchen stood at the center of that anxiety. Even the utensils tell part of the story. Many ordinary people had very few. A pot, a knife, wooden bowls, perhaps a simple iron pan if fortune allowed. Spoons were common. Forks much later and less universal. Bread itself often served as part of the tableware. Thick slices called trenchers could hold food and absorb juices before being eaten, given to the poor, or fed to animals depending on the household. This practical reuse made perfect sense in a world where nothing wasted easily. Waste itself was a moral and economic issue. Fat could be saved. Bones could flavor broth. Stale bread could be reused. Vegetable scraps might feed animals. Ash had uses. Even grease mattered. Modern kitchens often aim for convenience. Medieval kitchens aimed for endurance. And this endurance shaped taste. People today often imagine medieval food as either disgusting or strangely theatrical, but much of it was simply designed for reliability. Thick soups, dark breads, preserved foods, repeated flavors. These were not failures of imagination. They were strategies. Luxury meant escape from repetition. Fresh white bread, soft cheese, imported fruit, delicate pastries. These signaled that someone had enough wealth to demand variation. For everyone else, sameness was normal. And yet, within that sameness, people still cared deeply about good cooking. This is easy to forget. Pleasure did exist. Feast days mattered because ordinary days were ordinary. Honey was treasured. Fresh butter could feel like abundance. Good ale mattered. Herbs changed not just taste but dignity. Even a well-cooked onion soup could carry comfort in winter. The medieval kitchen was not joyless. It was simply honest about what joy cost. Perhaps nowhere is that clearer than in baking. Bread ovens were serious pieces of community infrastructure. Many villages relied on communal ovens or the Lord's oven, sometimes requiring fees to use them. Baking was not always a private household act. It could be regulated, taxed, and socially controlled. To bake bread was to touch authority. People knew the difference between their flour and the Lord's rights over it. Millers were watched carefully, often with suspicion, because grain passing through another man's hands meant trust mixed with resentment. The kitchen was political even before the bread arrived. And then there was smell. Modern reconstructions often show medieval kitchens beautifully. Stone walls, copper pots, golden light. They cannot fully recreate smell. Smoke, onions, damp wool, wet dogs, stale beer, animal fat, fish brine, spilled ale, rushes on the floor, herbs drying overhead, sweat from long labor, ashes cooling by the hearth. These smells layered together into something far more complex than food. A medieval kitchen was sensed before it was seen. Visitors from wealthier households might judge another family by it. Travelers remembered inns by it. Servants carried it on their clothes. Smell was social evidence. And if we follow smell outward, beyond the kitchen door, we begin to see that food preparation did not stop at the hearth. It extended into gardens, fields, markets, breweries, dairies, smokehouses, and rivers. The kitchen was only the final chamber of a much larger chain, which means that to truly understand why medieval kitchens were so difficult, we have to leave the room for a moment and follow the food backward to the people who made that room possible in the first place. It began in the field, often in cold morning light, with people whose names were rarely recorded. Peasants turning soil, women gathering herbs, children chasing stray chickens, laborers cutting hay before weather could ruin it. The kitchen's difficulty was not only in cooking, but in the long chain of effort required to make cooking possible at all. Take bread, for example, the most ordinary and most essential food in much of medieval Europe. Before it became a loaf on a table, it had already passed through months of risk. Grain had to be planted at the right time, protected from animals, watched through uncertain weather, harvested before rot or storm, threshed by hand, winnowed, carried, stored, and eventually taken to the mill. Every stage involved labor, and every stage offered a chance for failure. A poor harvest did not simply mean less bread. It meant thinner bodies, harder winters, and decisions no family wanted to make. Should grain be eaten now or saved for planting later? Should a chicken be slaughtered this month or kept alive in hope of eggs next month? These were kitchen decisions, but they were also survival mathematics. The mill itself could be a source of frustration. In many regions, Peasants were required to use the Lord's mill and pay for the privilege. This was not always seen as fair. Millers developed a complicated reputation in medieval literature, sometimes comic, often suspicious, because they stood between hunger and flour. People believed, not always wrongly, that grain could quietly disappear in another man's hands. A sack of flour was trust made visible. Then there was water. Modern kitchens treat water as invisible convenience. Medieval kitchens treated it as labor. Every pot of water had to come from somewhere: a village well, a stream, a river, a cistern, sometimes from surprisingly far away. Carrying it was repetitive, physical work, and clean water was never guaranteed. This matters because medieval cooking was inseparable from boiling. Water had to be heated for pottage, washing, brewing, preserving, and sometimes for making suspicious water safer to consume. Ale and small beer were often everyday drinks, not because people were constantly seeking intoxication, but because brewing created something more stable and often safer than untreated local water. Children drank weak ale. Workers drank ale. Monasteries brewed ale. Households measured comfort partly through whether the ale held up. The kitchen and the brewery were cousins. Milk created another set of problems. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, especially in warm weather, so dairy work moved fast. Butter, cheese, curds, and cream were not luxuries first, they were preservation strategies. Turning milk into something that lasted was practical intelligence. This work often fell heavily to women, and like so much domestic labor, it sat quietly beneath the more visible structures of power. Kings signed charters. Someone still had to keep the milk from turning. Eggs, too, were valuable in ways modern abundance can make hard to feel. A few hens represented steady usefulness. Chickens moved through village life almost like small domestic savings accounts. Modest, alive, and constantly watched. To waste food was to insult effort. This is why medieval recipes, where we have them, can sometimes seem less like instructions and more like reminders for people who already understood the fundamentals. The recipe was not the beginning. It assumed years of practical knowledge. It assumed you knew how hot the oven felt by standing near it. It assumed you knew whether dough was right by touch. It assumed you knew what kind of wood burned cleanest, which herbs would survive winter, and how long salted pork could safely wait. Cooking was sensory memory, and this memory changed by region. A kitchen in northern England did not smell or function exactly like one in southern Italy. Climate mattered. Soil mattered. Trade routes mattered. A coastal household might rely on fish in ways impossible inland. A forested region cooked with different fuel than a place where wood was scarce. Olive oil, butter, lard, these were not simply taste preferences. They were shaped by landscape. There was no single medieval kitchen. There were thousands of kitchens, each shaped by geography and class. Yet one thing remained nearly universal. Work began early. Before sunrise, in many households, someone was already awake managing the day's first tasks. The fire had to be checked. Bread might need attention. Animals demanded feeding before people did. Porridge or pottage for the morning had to begin. Breakfast, where it existed as a formal meal, was often practical rather than ceremonial. Many adults worked first and ate simply. The rhythm of food followed labor, not leisure. And because daylight mattered, the kitchen followed the sun. Much of the heavier work happened when there was light to do it. Candles were expensive. Firelight was useful but limited. Night reduced options. By winter, short days made domestic planning even more intense. This is another hidden reason medieval kitchens felt harder. Time itself behaved differently. You could not casually decide to bake at midnight. Season ruled the kitchen. Autumn was preservation season, salting, smoking, storing, preparing against winter. Summer demanded speed against spoilage. Lent changed diets. Feast days disrupted routine. Harvest failures reshaped entire menus. A medieval cook was not only feeding people, they were negotiating the calendar. Even aristocratic kitchens were disciplined by nature. The lord might request imported luxuries, but he still depended on roads, weather, fisheries, local estates, and servants who could make those luxuries arrive in edible condition. Luxury was fragile. Fresh fruit out of season was not merely expensive. It was improbable. Spices crossed enormous distances and cost accordingly. Sugar, when available in earlier periods, was closer to medicine and elite display than everyday sweetness. White flour required refinement and money. The rich ate differently, but they did not escape dependence. In fact, wealth often made kitchens more complicated. A noble table expected variety, symbolism, and abundance. Hunting supplied venison, boar, and birds not simply for taste but for prestige. Banquets required coordination between kitchen staff, stewards, and household officers. The meal had to arrive in sequence. It had to reflect status. It had to reassure guests that order and prosperity existed. Food was political theater served on platters, and kitchens were backstage. This backstage could be surprisingly disciplined. Some great households kept written accounts of ingredients, fuel, purchases, and wages. Monasteries tracked stores with almost bureaucratic precision. Royal kitchens could function like military supply chains, but precision did not remove unpredictability. Rats still found grain. A cook could still fall ill. A storm could still delay fish. A dog could still steal meat if someone turned away at the wrong moment. Medieval kitchens were systems built against chaos, but never free from it. Perhaps this is why superstition sometimes lived there too. Households developed habits that sat somewhere between practical wisdom and ritual caution. Certain days were luckier for baking. Certain failures felt like warnings. Folk knowledge about herbs, preservation, and household luck blurred easily with belief. The kitchen was a place where people confronted uncertainty every day. It is not surprising they wanted patterns. Even cats held a strange status in this world. Useful for controlling mice, tolerated for necessity, occasionally treated with affection and sometimes suspicion, cats belonged to the practical mythology of the kitchen. Grain stores attracted rodents. Rodents threatened survival. A cat sleeping near sacks of grain was not decoration. It was quiet economic protection. Dogs, too, hovered at the edge of kitchen life, begging, guarding, stealing scraps when possible, living close enough to remind everyone that households were never sealed spaces. Animals were not separate from domestic life. They were part of its texture. And then there were children. Modern viewers often imagine childhood as protected distance from adult labor. In many medieval homes, children entered kitchen work early, carrying water, gathering eggs, turning spits, fetching herbs, cleaning tools. Small tasks taught necessary habits. The kitchen was a school before it was a room. Children learned responsibility there, but also danger. Fire burned without mercy. Knives did not care about age. Heavy pots slipped. Ash blinded. Work itself taught caution. No one needed a lecture on household risk. The kitchen provided daily reminders. And still, despite all of this, it remained a place of memory. People remembered family through food long before recipes were written down neatly in books. A certain soup in winter. A certain loaf on feast days. A certain smell that meant someone had returned from market. History often survives through governments and wars, but ordinary life survives through kitchens, which is why when famine struck or plague moved through a town, or war passed close enough to empty granaries, people felt the crisis first not in abstract politics, but in the kitchen itself. The pot grew thinner, the bread grew darker, the silence around the table changed, And that is where the story becomes even more revealing, because the medieval kitchen was not only a place of labor and routine, but one of the first places where disaster announced itself. It arrived quietly first. A loaf slightly smaller than usual. A market stall with less grain than last month. A servant returning from town with bad news about prices. A barrel of ale stretched thinner. A cook cutting portions smaller and hoping no one noticed. The kitchen noticed before the chronicles did. Famine was not always a sudden emptiness. Often it began as adjustment. People diluted soups more heavily. Bread was mixed with cheaper grains, peas, beans, or whatever could stretch flour further. Meat disappeared from ordinary tables first, then cheese became rarer, then butter, then even the expectation of variety quietly vanished. The kitchen became a place of negotiation. Who ate first? Who could work hardest? Who needed strength for the fields? Who was already too weak? These were not abstract moral questions. They were decisions made over actual bowls. In peasant households, hunger exposed the brutal arithmetic of survival. A family with little margin could be pushed into crisis by one failed harvest, one sick cow, one winter too long. If seed grain was eaten, next year was endangered. If livestock were sold, immediate hunger might ease while future security collapsed. There was no clean answer, and women, often managing food distribution inside the household, stood at the center of these choices. Medieval records rarely describe their private calculations, but the logic is there. Someone decided how much flour remained. Someone decided whether the children received more. Someone quietly skipped a portion. The kitchen kept those secrets. Even noble households were not untouched, though wealth softened the blow. Lords with reserves could purchase grain, demand rents, or shift scarcity downward onto tenants. A bad year for the manor hall and a bad year for the village were not the same experience. This is one reason medieval kitchens also reveal inequality so clearly. The Lord's table. A feast might still be staged during regional hardship, not because suffering was invisible, but because visible abundance was part of power itself. Stability had to be performed. A full table reassured allies. It also reminded dependents who still controlled resources. To modernize, this can feel cold, but medieval society was built around expectations of hierarchy. Hospitality was a duty, but so was display. A noble household that appeared weak could invite political danger. So the kitchen served politics even in famine. And then there was plague. The Black Death, beginning in the mid-14th century, changed nearly every part of European life, but kitchens felt it in particularly intimate ways. Illness transformed not only who was eating, but who was left to cook. Servants died. Cooks disappeared. Entire households lost the ordinary people who made ordinary life function. The great historical image is often the cart, the priest, the burial ground. But inside homes, plague also meant unfinished bread, cold hearths, abandoned pots. A kitchen without workers was a house losing its rhythm. And illness changed attitudes toward food itself. People feared corruption, bad air, spoiled matter, dangerous imbalance. Medieval medical theory did not understand bacteria, but it understood that food, smell, environment, and health were connected. Households paid close attention to what was considered strengthening, cleansing, or suspicious during sickness. Broths, spiced wine, certain herbs, vinegar washes, these were practical responses shaped by the medical thinking of the time. The kitchen became part infirmary. And during plague years, fear entered even ordinary gestures. Sharing cups, touching bread, proximity around communal meals, things once routine could feel uncertain. Social trust thinned alongside appetite. Yet kitchens also became places of resilience. People still had to eat. Even amid catastrophe, fires were lit, bread was made, broth was stirred for the sick. Survival often looked less like heroism and more like someone continuing to prepare food in impossible circumstances. This is one of history's quiet truths. Civilization survives through repetition. Someone still washes the pot. War brought its own version of kitchen disruption. Armies did not only fight battles. They consumed landscapes. Soldiers passing through could take grain, livestock, fuel, tools, sometimes through formal requisition, often through theft disguised as necessity. Villages near military roads learned quickly that kitchens were vulnerable long before walls were breached. An army did not need to burn your house to damage your future. It only needed your winter grain. Women hid flour. Families buried stores. Livestock were moved at night. Communities learned the geography of concealment because they understood exactly what disappeared first in war: food. And again, kitchens became the place where political events turned real. A king declaring war might sound distant. An empty grain chest did not. Even castles, symbols of strength, were ultimately kitchens under pressure during siege. Romantic stories focus on walls and battles, but sieges were often decided by bread, salt, and water. How much grain remained? How many mouths needed feeding? How long before horses became food instead of transport? A castle kitchen during siege became a mathematics of desperation. Stored food was rationed. Fresh food vanished. Men on battlements depended entirely on the discipline of what happened near the hearth below. Victory and hunger were closer than most stories admit. Religious fasting could be chosen. Siege hunger was not. And then there were towns. Urban kitchens had their own particular problems. In a crowded medieval city, fuel was expensive, space was limited, fire risk was constant, and access to fresh food depended heavily on markets. Many people did not produce what they ate. They bought it daily. That created dependence. A baker's dishonesty, a butcher's spoiled meat, a fish seller's bad stock. These were public concerns. Cities regulated food aggressively because bad food was not merely unpleasant. It threatened order. Bread weights were inspected. Ill quality was watched. Butchers could be punished. Bakers could be shamed. Food regulation was civic stability. People rioted over bread not because they were irrational, but because they understood exactly how close hunger stood. The medieval city kitchen was therefore both domestic and public. Your dinner depended on strangers. Trust had a price. Inns and taverns reveal another side of this world. Travelers relied on kitchens they did not control, and reputation mattered enormously. A good inn was remembered for decent ale, reliable stew, and bread that did not feel like punishment. A bad one was remembered for fleas, watered drink, and the suspicion that yesterday's meat had become today's pie. Hospitality had limits. Medieval travelers often accepted discomfort as normal, but food remained a powerful measure of trust. To be fed properly was to be treated as human. To be fed badly was a warning. And behind all of this was preservation, the constant battle against time. Salting, smoking, drying, fermenting, pickling. These were not side techniques but the architecture of survival. A household that failed to preserve properly in autumn might pay for it in February. Winter judged the kitchen harshly. Fresh greens vanished. Variety narrowed. Smokehouses and cellars became the memory of summer. The question was never whether preserved food was ideal. The question was whether it lasted. Salt especially shaped entire economies. Preserved fish, meat, butter, and power. Salt routes mattered politically because kitchens depended on them. A world without refrigeration was a world where salt approached strategic importance. To own it, trade it, or tax it was to influence survival. Even sweetness followed this logic. Honey mattered because sugar was rare and expensive for much of the medieval period. Beekeeping was practical wealth. honey-sweetened food, flavored drink, and supported medicine. Bees belonged to the kitchen's extended kingdom. Again, the ordinary reveals the larger world. A spoonful of honey connected fields, flowers, labor, and trade. Nothing was small. This is perhaps why medieval kitchens can feel so strangely modern and so distant at the same time. We still gather around food. We still measure comfort through meals. But we are often insulated from the chain behind them. Medieval people were not. They knew exactly how much work sat inside a loaf of bread. They knew what weather had done to barley. They knew what smoke cost the lungs. They knew what it meant when the pot simmered thin. That awareness gave food a different moral weight. Waste felt sharper. Hospitality felt heavier. Hunger felt closer. And nowhere was that moral weight more visible than during feast days, when the kitchen had to transform scarcity into celebration, and ordinary households, sometimes even poor ones, attempted for a brief moment to make abundance visible. And that effort to create abundance, even briefly, tells us something important about how medieval people understood food. A feast was never just about eating. It was about order, gratitude, memory, obligation, and sometimes survival disguised as celebration. In a world where ordinary meals could be repetitive and lean, feast days carried emotional weight far beyond the table itself. Christmas, Easter, harvest festivals, weddings, saints' days, successful births, the return of a family member, the arrival of honored guests. These moments asked the kitchen to become something more than practical. It had to become symbolic. Even poor households tried, when possible, to mark the difference. A little more butter than usual, better bread, a saved piece of meat, honey brought out from careful storage, ale stronger than the daily weak brew, a pie made not because it was necessary, but because it felt like dignity. Celebration often meant visible effort. It reminded people that life was not only endurance. This mattered especially in winter, when feast days could interrupt the psychological heaviness of cold months. Midwinter food was memory and reassurance. A full table, however modest, said that the household still held together. The kitchen produced morale. In noble houses, of course, feast culture expanded into spectacle. A great hall during a winter celebration was theater. Roasted swan, peacock, venison, elaborate pies, sugared dishes in later centuries, imported wine, decorative subtleties shaped from sugar or pastry. These were not simply meals. They were statements. A lord feeding others was displaying power, generosity, and legitimacy. Guests judged him by it. Too little looked weak. Too much, if handled badly, looked foolish. Hospitality required performance but also control. The kitchen had to deliver abundance without visible chaos. That was harder than it sounds. Imagine dozens of dishes requiring different timing, served in sequence, each dependent on fire, servants, fuel, ingredients, and communication across a crowded estate. A feast was not culinary romance. It was logistics under pressure. And because preservation mattered, not every luxury was what modern people imagine. Fresh fruit in winter was rare. Fresh herbs depended on place and season. Many noble dishes relied on preserved ingredients, dried fruits, spices, and careful storage rather than constant freshness. The prestige was often in access and management, not simple freshness. A well-stocked pantry was a form of political security. This also shaped the architecture of kitchens and adjoining spaces. Pantries, larders, dairies, brewhouses, bakehouses, smokehouses, cellars. These were extensions of the kitchen's authority. They formed a network around the central problem of keeping food safe long enough to matter. The pantry was not glamorous, but it was power. And with storage came another permanent enemy: vermin. Rats and mice were not occasional annoyances. They were strategic threats. They ate grain, contaminated food, spread damage, and reminded households how fragile security really was. Cats helped, traps helped, vigilance helped, but no one truly won. Grain storage was a constant defensive act. This is another reason medieval kitchens felt harder than we often imagine. The fight was never finished. You did not clean once and solve the problem. You managed decay. That management extended to cookware itself. A modern kitchen can replace a damaged pan with relative ease. Medieval households treated tools differently. Pots were valuable. Knives mattered. Iron was not casually disposable. Repairs were ordinary. Handles were replaced. Cracks were tolerated longer. Wooden bowls were mended. Nothing left the household lightly. Objects stayed long enough to become familiar. The kitchen was full of things worn by use rather than designed for beauty. Even table manners reflected this practical world. We often imagine medieval dining as either barbaric chaos or rigid aristocratic ritual, but reality sat somewhere in between, depending heavily on class. Hands were common tools. Shared dishes were normal. Washing before meals mattered because fingers touched food directly. Napkins existed for the wealthy, rougher cloths for others. Etiquette existed, but it was shaped by material life. A knife at the table was ordinary. A personal fork, for much of the medieval period in much of Europe, was not. The spread of forks later would say something profound about changing ideas of refinement, but for most of the Middle Ages, eating remained physically direct. You felt your food. This physical closeness to food also shaped relationships with animals. Modern industrial distance did not exist. If a household ate a chicken, someone usually knew that chicken. If a pig was slaughtered, the event was visible, practical, and often communal. Meat was not abstract. Slaughter days were significant. They demanded speed, cooperation, and skill. Blood had uses. Fat had uses. Skin had uses. Bones had uses. Preservation began immediately. Nothing about the process encouraged wasteful sentimentality, but neither was it emotionally empty. People understood cost because they had seen it. This is one reason feast meat carried such meaning. It represented labor, wealth, and sacrifice in a literal sense. The medieval kitchen was honest about origins, and honesty extended to servants. For many young people, especially girls entering service, kitchen work was one of the first available paths into another household. Service offered food, lodging, training, and sometimes opportunity, but it also meant vulnerability. A kitchen servant lived inside hierarchy. She learned quickly whose voice mattered, whose temper to avoid, when to speak, when to disappear, how to stretch ingredients without blame, how to move through a house without being noticed until needed. Domestic service was education in power. For boys, too, kitchen labor could be a beginning, turning spits, carrying wood, assisting bakers, learning discipline through repetition. Advancement was possible, but never guaranteed. Many lives were spent entirely in the background of someone else's table. History tends to remember the diners. The kitchen remembers the workers. And sometimes, unexpectedly, kitchens created influence. Trusted cooks, senior household managers, experienced brewers, these people could hold quiet authority because they controlled reliability. A lord might ignore many servants, but not the one responsible for whether guests were fed properly or whether ale stores lasted through winter. Dependability became a kind of invisible power. To know the household's appetite was to know the household itself. This was especially true in monasteries and convents, where food discipline carried spiritual meaning. Meals followed rules. Fasting mattered. Excess could become moral failure. Kitchens were therefore tied not only to health and economics, but to ideas of virtue. Gluttony was a sin. Moderation was moral architecture. Yet monasteries were also famous for good brewing, fish management, and efficient kitchens, which reminds us that religious restraint did not mean culinary incompetence. It meant order. Even silence at meals, practiced in some communities, changed the emotional texture of eating. Imagine a hall where food arrives, bowls are shared, and the dominant sound is not conversation but spoons, benches, and the reading of scripture. The kitchen fed both body and discipline. And then there were the smells of baking days. If daily kitchen life could be smoky and heavy, bread baking sometimes brought something close to anticipation. Villages knew the scent. Fresh bread altered mood. It meant warmth, readiness, temporary security. The smell traveled. Children noticed it first. Travelers remembered it. Even now, centuries later, the smell of baking bread still carries emotional force because it speaks to something older than preference. It speaks to safety. That is why bad bread felt like insult. Adulterated flour, dishonest weights, badly baked loaves. These were not small complaints. They challenged trust at the most ordinary level. Bread was the contract between ruler and ruled, baker and buyer, household and winter. A failed loaf meant more than inconvenience. This helps explain why urban authorities punished bakers so publicly. Bread was political peace in edible form, and when peace failed, kitchens adapted with grim creativity. People used substitutes they would have preferred not to mention. Coarser grains, chestnuts, beans, ground peas, sometimes desperate ingredients that signaled true scarcity rather than culinary choice. Recipe books rarely celebrate desperation, but archaeology and records quietly reveal it. People survived by lowering standards before they surrendered hope. There is dignity in that. The medieval kitchen was not impressive because it was beautiful. It was impressive because it kept functioning. It did so through smoke, fatigue, unequal labor, spoiled food, harsh winters, and constant uncertainty. It turned unstable harvests into daily life. And perhaps the strangest twist is this. For all its discomfort, people were deeply attached to it. Because the kitchen was not only where work happened. It was where news arrived, where neighbors stood for a moment by the fire, where someone recovering from illness was given broth, where an old recipe carried memory of a grandmother no one else still remembered, where arguments happened and reconciliations too, where winter evenings lasted longer than expected, where ordinary life, unrecorded and essential, kept repeating. The kitchen was rarely the most beautiful room, but it may have been the most human one. And if we want to understand just how human it was, we have to look not only at the food and the labor, but at the people who gathered around it after the work was done, because the table itself tells another story. Because once the work of the kitchen was finished, or at least paused for a few hours, the table became its own kind of map. Who sat where, who was served first, who stood instead of sitting, who received the best portion, who waited until everyone else had eaten. These details were not small social habits. They were the household made visible. Food was rarely private. Even in modest homes, eating was often collective because space, labor, and resources made privacy impractical. Families shared the same room, the same hearth, and often the same rhythm of hunger. Meals marked the structure of the day not because they were leisurely, but because they briefly gathered everyone into the same necessity. At a peasant table, if there was a true table at all rather than benches and boards brought into use when needed, the meal might be simple enough to disappear from formal history entirely. Bread, pottage, perhaps onions, perhaps cheese, perhaps ale. In better seasons, eggs, fish, or meat. In worse seasons, repetition and patience. Yet these meals still carried meaning. A father returning from field labor, children watching portions carefully, an older relative eating more slowly, a guest offered the better place by the fire. This was social order without ceremony. Hospitality mattered even when there was very little to give. In fact, it may have mattered more. To offer bread to a traveler when your own stores were uncertain was not politeness. It was moral seriousness. Medieval Christian teaching, local custom, and practical community expectations all supported the idea that feeding others was part of being a decent person, even if reality sometimes fell short. People remembered generosity. They also remembered stinginess. In noble halls, the table became theater. The Lord's seat mattered. Proximity to power mattered. Guests were arranged carefully. Servants moved according to rank. The meal itself was choreography. To be placed near the high table was recognition. To be placed far from it was information. Even salt could become symbolic. The old phrase, above the salt, reflects a real habit in later medieval and early modern elite dining. Valuable items like salt cellars sat prominently, and proximity to them could signal status. Whether every household practiced this exactly as later stories suggest matters less than the broader truth. The table announced hierarchy. You could read a room by watching dinner. This was especially important during political meals. Marriage negotiations, alliances, disputes between neighboring lords, religious celebrations, seasonal feasts. Food created a stage where relationships could be displayed without always being spoken. A well-served guest understood respect. A slight delay, a missing courtesy, a poor placement, these could carry meaning too. Diplomacy often smelled like roasted meat. And still, even inside ceremony, ordinary discomfort remained. Great halls could be cold despite fire. Smoke drifted. Dogs moved beneath benches. Bones were handled directly. Lighting was limited. People ate heavily salted food because preservation required it. Fine linen and polished manners did not remove the physical reality of the room. Medieval elegance was never sterile. This is another place where modern imagination often gets lost. We tend to divide the past into either muddy hardship or royal beauty, but the truth lived in their overlap. A noble banquet could be magnificent and inconvenient at the same time. Luxury did not mean modern comfort. It meant controlled inconvenience. The same applies to tableware. Silver cups and decorated trenchers existed for the wealthy, but even then, much dining remained shared and practical. A large communal dish might serve several people. Personal plates were less universal than many imagine. Bread itself often functioned as an edible platform. A trencher soaked up juices, held food, and then either became part of the meal or was passed along. Nothing about this system encouraged distance from food. You touched it, smelled it, negotiated it with the people around you. That closeness shaped conversation too. Meals were not always lively in the modern sense. In some religious settings, silence dominated. In noble houses, formal behavior could restrain spontaneity. In peasant homes, exhaustion itself limited performance. After a day of labor, many people were not seeking brilliant conversation. They were seeking warmth and enough food. Yet meals still created memory. Stories were told there. News arrived there. Marriages were discussed there. Children learned manners there. Grievances surfaced there because everyone was present and there was nowhere else to hide. The table could be peaceful. It could also be the most dangerous place in the house for family tension. Inheritance arguments, resentment between servants, frustration over scarce food, suspicion about fairness. None of these vanished because supper was served. In fact, food often sharpened them. Who received the larger piece could become a quiet accusation. The kitchen prepared meals. The table revealed justice. This was especially true in households where servants and masters ate differently. Domestic workers were fed, but not equally. Timing, quality, and quantity reflected hierarchy. The leftovers of elite dining could still be better than ordinary peasant meals. But the principle remained clear. Rank determined appetite. Even hunger was structured. Children learned this early. They learned when adults ate first, when guests mattered more than routine, when feast days altered rules, when fasting changed expectations. They learned not only taste, but position. Food educated them into society. And there was one category of people whose relationship to the table could be especially revealing: women. In many households, women organized much of the labor behind the meal while receiving less public recognition at the meal itself. Noblewomen could exercise real authority through household management, including food stores, servant discipline, and feast planning, but public prestige often remained attached to the male head of household. He hosted. She made hosting possible. In peasant homes, the imbalance looked different but still existed. The person who stretched grain, remembered stores, watched the children's portions, and quietly made scarcity survivable was often not the person later described in legal records. The table made labor visible only imperfectly. Still, there were moments when food gave women unmistakable influence. Weddings, childbirth recoveries, religious observances, neighborly exchanges of bread, ale, herbs, and care. Informal power moved through kitchens more often than formal history admits. Recipes themselves could be inheritance. Not written recipes most of the time, but remembered ones. A way of thickening broth. A way of preserving apples. A way of stretching feast food for one more day after guests had gone. Domestic knowledge traveled person to person, not page to page. This is why kitchens were also archives. Not official archives with seals and parchment, but living ones. Techniques survived there. Customs survived there. Regional identities survived there. A household could lose money, land, even status, and still carry memory in the way it prepared bread. Culture sat in the pot. And sometimes, unexpectedly, strangers entered that world. Travelers, pilgrims, merchants, priests, wandering laborers. Medieval life was not static, and hospitality brought outside stories into the kitchen's orbit. A traveler by the fire could carry news from another town, another lord, another kingdom. The kitchen was sometimes the first newsroom. Before written reports reached ordinary people, rumors traveled by road and were repeated near the hearth. A war somewhere else became real when a traveler described burned villages. A new tax became real when someone explained what had happened in the next market town. History entered the house through conversation and bread. Even disease traveled this way. Suspicion of outsiders during plague years was not simple cruelty. It was tied to the frightening reality that movement could mean danger. Yet the same roads that carried risk also carried trade, opportunity, and information. Hospitality and caution lived uncomfortably together. Inns occupied that tension perfectly. An inn table gathered strangers who might never meet again. Merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, clerks, local drinkers. Different classes brushing against one another through food and ale. It was one of the few places where social boundaries could blur slightly, though never disappear. People watched each other there, who paid easily, who asked too many questions, who drank too much, who carried expensive boots but poor manners. A meal was social evidence. And because ale and wine shaped these spaces, the line between kitchen and tavern often blurred. Brewing was domestic, commercial, and social all at once. Weak daily ale belonged to ordinary life. Stronger drink belonged to celebration, negotiation, and sometimes trouble. Many decisions were made with a cup in hand. Not all of them wise, but even here moderation was judged morally. Excess drinking was criticized in sermons and mocked in stories, not because medieval people were uniquely strict, but because disorder threatened households already balanced on narrow margins. A man who drank too much was not merely embarrassing. He was expensive. Again, the kitchen leads back to survival. And perhaps nowhere is this clearer than in old age. For elderly people, especially those without strong family protection, food security could become frighteningly fragile. The kitchen that once depended on their labor might become a place where they relied on others' generosity. Soft foods mattered. Warm broth mattered. Social kindness mattered. To be fed was dignity. To be forgotten at the table was a kind of social death. This emotional truth sits quietly beneath all the material details. The medieval kitchen was about fire, labor, and scarcity, yes, but also about belonging. To be invited to eat was to be included. To be excluded was to be warned. Which is why kitchens appear so often, even indirectly, in stories of betrayal, marriage, reconciliation, and power. People trusted one another through food long before they trusted one another through words. And when that trust broke, the break could begin with something as simple as a shared cup, a refused loaf, or a seat left empty where someone should have been. And sometimes, that break was far more literal than symbolic. Because for all the warmth associated with the hearth, the medieval kitchen could also be one of the most dangerous rooms in any household. Fire gave life, but it demanded constant respect, and when that respect slipped, even for a moment, the consequences could move faster than anyone in the room. A spark in dry rushes on the floor, a hanging cloth too close to flame, grease catching unexpectedly, an oven left too hot, a child moving too near the hearth. These were ordinary possibilities, not dramatic accidents. In a world built largely of timber, straw, cloth, and stored fuel, the kitchen was never far from catastrophe. House fires were common enough to shape architecture, law, and memory. People feared them with good reason. A single domestic fire could destroy not only a household, but an entire street. In tightly packed towns, especially where upper stories leaned over narrow roads and workshops sat close to homes, flames traveled with terrifying speed. Wind could turn an accident into a public disaster before church bells finished warning the neighborhood. The smell of smoke at the wrong hour meant panic. Buckets were passed by hand. Wells became crowded. Neighbors who argued yesterday suddenly formed desperate lines to save one another's roofs. Monasteries, guilds, and city authorities all took fire prevention seriously because everyone understood the scale of the threat. The kitchen was private until it became everyone's problem. This is one reason many urban governments regulated ovens and bakehouses carefully. Professional bakers often used larger communal ovens partly because they were more efficient, but also because concentrating fire in controlled places made sense. Domestic baking still happened, of course, but large public ovens reduced risk and reinforced authority at the same time. Once again, the kitchen and politics met at the same flame. In castles and manor houses, separate kitchen buildings were often practical protection. If the kitchen burned, the lord preferred not to lose the entire hall with it. Distance reduced risk and smoke alike. It also meant servants carried food farther. Luxury often depended on someone else walking through cold corridors with heavy dishes. And burns themselves were ordinary injuries. Hands scarred by cooking were not unusual. Hot iron, boiling broth, open flames, spitting fat from roasting meat, kitchen labor left marks. For servants whose work depended entirely on physical ability, a serious burn could mean more than pain, could threaten employment, reputation, and survival. There was no simple recovery. The same was true for cuts. Knives were essential tools, and sharpening mattered because a bad blade could be as dangerous as a good one. But sharpness meant risk. Fish cleaning, butchering, bread cutting, trimming herbs, opening sacks. Hands were always near edges. The kitchen was full of small injuries history rarely records. Yet everyone remembered them. And beyond physical danger, there was another quieter threat: contamination. Not contamination in the modern scientific sense of bacteria and refrigeration standards, but the medieval understanding of corruption. food gone bad, smells turned wrong, illness following a suspicious meal. People did not need germ theory to fear spoiled meat. They had experience. A bad pot of stew could sicken an entire household. Fish that traveled too far inland in summer could be disastrous. Milk turned fast. Soft fruit invited trouble. Preservation failures revealed themselves late and often unpleasantly. The kitchen, therefore, required a kind of practical skepticism. You smelled first. You watched texture. You noticed color. You listened to the judgment of older women, experienced cooks, and servants who had seen enough failures to trust instinct over optimism. Much of medieval domestic knowledge was simply pattern recognition, and trust mattered enormously because poisoning, real or feared, occupied a strange place in the imagination. Among nobles especially, fear of deliberate poisoning could become political. Whether common or exaggerated, the possibility mattered because meals were intimate acts of trust. To eat food prepared by others was to place your body inside their reliability. Kings employed tasters. Lords watched kitchens carefully. Rumors spread easily. Poisoning stories often say more about anxiety and power than about chemistry, but the fear itself was real. The kitchen, after all, was one of the few places where invisible harm could enter openly. This gave cooks a strange reputation in some stories: respected, necessary, and occasionally feared. To control the food was to stand close to power. And then there was smoke again, not dramatic fire, but the slow, ordinary damage of breathing badly for years. We often romanticize the image of the hearth. Warm light, old stone, hanging herbs. But long-term smoke exposure meant coughing, eye irritation, headaches, and likely chronic lung problems, especially for those closest to the fire every day. Kitchen workers aged inside smoke. Women who spent years near open hearths knew its cost intimately. Children raised beside poorly vented fires learned it early. Wealth could buy better chimneys, but most people lived closer to the problem. The kitchen warmed the body while quietly exhausting it. And still, it remained necessary. This contradiction sits at the center of medieval domestic life. The same room that fed you could injure you. The same fire that protected against winter could destroy the house. The same preserved meat that saved February could make August dangerous. Comfort and danger shared walls. This was true even in childbirth and illness. The warmest room in many houses was often near the hearth, and warmth mattered during recovery. Women giving birth, the sick, and the elderly were often kept close to heat because cold itself was considered threatening. Broth was prepared there. Water was heated there. Herbs were steeped there. The kitchen could become a healing room, but it could also become the room where illness spread fastest if household care failed. Shared utensils, close quarters, constant traffic, domestic intimacy had consequences. Again, the kitchen sat at the center. And perhaps nowhere did this mixture of danger and dependence feel stronger than in winter. Winter narrowed everything. Days shortened. Fuel became precious. Fresh food disappeared. Roads worsened. Travel slowed. Smoke thickened because windows stayed closed against cold. People lived closer to one another and closer to the hearth. The kitchen became even more central because the outside world became less forgiving. A failed fire on a January morning was not inconvenience. It was threat. A shortage of wood changed sleeping arrangements, work rhythms, and appetite. People clustered near warmth because distance from warmth meant real physical misery. Medieval winters were not aesthetic snow scenes. They were calculations about fuel and endurance. Even wealthy households respected winter's authority. Large halls could still be cold. Stone held chill. Drafts found every weakness in architecture. Kitchens, for all their discomfort, were often among the few reliably warm places. Servants knew this. Children knew it. Old people knew it. Warmth was social gravity. and so people gathered there for reasons beyond cooking. Mending, conversation, small domestic work, quiet waiting, all drifted toward the hearth. The kitchen was sometimes the only room where life felt manageable after dark. This is why memory clings to it. Not because it was pleasant in every moment, but because it was where people remained close enough to one another to feel like a household. A grandmother teaching a child how to shape dough. A father sharpening a tool while soup thickened. Neighbors stepping in from rain with news. A servant stealing a moment of rest by the fading fire. An argument softened because everyone was too tired to continue. History survives in these small scenes more honestly than in portraits. And yet kitchens could also become places of suspicion. Who took extra bread? Who drank more ale than was fair? Who was secretly selling eggs at market? Who failed to preserve enough salt pork for Lent? Domestic tension often wore practical clothing. Because food was measurable, fairness could be argued in visible ways. Resentment attached easily to portions. A family under strain did not always speak about love or disappointment directly. They spoke about stores, waste, and responsibility. The kitchen translated emotion into inventory. This was true in marriage as well. A successful household required cooperation, and food management was part of that judgment. A spouse described as wasteful, careless, or unable to manage domestic order could be criticized not only personally but morally. Prudence was virtue. Extravagance was dangerous. Many moral lessons of the medieval world passed through kitchen language because everyone understood its stakes. Waste the bread, and you were not merely careless. You were untrustworthy. Burn the supper repeatedly, and it became commentary on character. Domestic competence carried moral weight. And because kitchens carried that weight, they also became places where social expectations were enforced. Mothers taught daughters, masters corrected servants, older women judged younger ones, and everyone watched who adapted and who failed. Skill brought respect. Repeated failure brought memory. The kitchen did not forget. Even celebrations tested this. Weddings, especially, often placed enormous pressure on household food systems. Guests expected generosity. Families wanted dignity. Reputation sat directly beside the roast. A badly remembered wedding meal could outlive the marriage itself. People talked. Villages always talk. Which brings us to another truth. Medieval kitchens were never entirely private, even in private homes. Neighbors borrowed yeast, exchanged salt, commented on smells, noticed shortages, and quietly judged prosperity through what seemed to appear or disappear from someone's table. Food was social evidence long before social media, and because of that, kitchens told stories before anyone intended them to. A better loaf than usual meant something. No smoke from the chimney for 2 days meant something else. A widow suddenly baking for more people than lived in her house invited questions. Domestic life was visible, which means the medieval kitchen was not only where history was lived. It was often where history could first be observed, if you knew how to look. And one of the clearest places to look was the market, where the private labor of the kitchen met the public world beyond the door. And the market, in many ways, was simply the kitchen turned outward. It was where private hunger became public negotiation, where the success or failure of harvests could be read in prices before they were fully understood in words, and where the ordinary work of feeding a household met the larger machinery of trade, law, and reputation. A medieval kitchen could not exist in isolation for long. Even families who grew much of their own food still depended on exchange. Salt from elsewhere, iron for tools, grain in a bad year, cloth sacks, pottery, fish from rivers they did not live beside, spices if fortune allowed, candles, oil, sometimes even the right kind of wood. The market was where necessity became visible, and it was rarely quiet. Imagine a town square before noon. Carts arriving early, mud depending on weather, chickens protesting from wicker baskets, fish sellers hoping to sell before the day turned too warm, bakers protecting fresh loaves from theft and rain, women comparing prices with the seriousness of military planning. The smell was its own kind of map. Fresh bread near the ovens, wet wool, animal dung, the herbs, smoke from nearby cook fires, salt fish, onion skins underfoot, sweat, rain on timber. No one visiting such a place would mistake it for romance, but they would understand very quickly that the health of the town lived there. Markets were watched carefully because food was political. Town authorities regulated weights, prices, quality, and timing not simply to appear orderly, but because unstable food supply threatened peace. Bread shortages could become riots. Dishonest scales could destroy trust. Spoiled meat sold openly could turn into anger faster than officials could respond. A baker cheating customers was not just a bad merchant. He was a civic problem. This is why medieval punishments for food fraud could be surprisingly public. Bakers, brewers, and butchers were sometimes fined, shamed, or otherwise punished in ways meant to restore trust visibly. Communities wanted to see justice because everyone understood the danger of corrupted essentials. Food required belief. If people stopped trusting bread, the town itself felt unstable. Women often stood at the center of this world in practical ways. In many regions, women were regular market participants, selling eggs, butter, cheese, herbs, garden produce, small ale, poultry, and domestic goods that connected directly to kitchen survival. A household's economic flexibility often depended on these small transactions. A few eggs sold well could mean lamp oil. A little butter could become cloth. A basket of onions might pay a fee no one wanted to delay. This was not extra money. It was household engineering. And because of that, market reputation mattered deeply. A person known for watered ale, bad cheese, dishonest measures, or unreliable goods damaged not only income but social standing. Trust was the real currency. People remembered who sold fairly. They remembered who did not. This is another reason medieval kitchens were harder than we think. Feeding a household was not only labor inside the home. It required social intelligence outside it, negotiating prices, maintaining reputation, knowing seasons, reading shortages before they became emergencies. The cook was often also a strategist, and markets revealed class differences instantly. A noble steward buying for a large household moved differently than a village woman counting small coins for winter onions. Wealth purchased margin. Poverty purchased calculation. The same loaf could mean convenience to one person and the entire day's planning to another. This gap shaped emotional life. To the wealthy, spices might signal prestige. To the poor, salt itself could feel expensive enough to matter. And yet the same market served both worlds, which created constant visibility. People saw abundance and scarcity standing beside one another. A lord's servants buying imported wine while laborers argued over barley was not an abstract lesson in inequality. It was Tuesday. The kitchen taught class, and the market confirmed it. Seasonal rhythms made this sharper. Autumn markets were full of urgency. Grain, apples, onions, slaughtered animals, preserved goods, everything tied to preparing for winter. Spring carried different tension, especially if winter stores had run low. Late winter and early spring could be the hungriest time, when old stores weakened and new growth had not yet arrived. This period, sometimes called the hungry gap, sat heavily over ordinary life. A kitchen in March often felt different from a kitchen in September. Hope had a season. Fresh greens returning after winter were not decorative pleasures. They were relief. The first signs of new food mattered emotionally as much as nutritionally. They marked survival. People did not need poetry to feel that. The table changed, and everyone noticed. Markets also connected kitchens to distant worlds. Pepper from Asia, saffron from Mediterranean trade routes, wine from particular regions, fine salt from controlled sources. Elite kitchens especially were linked to systems far beyond local fields. A noble feast in England could contain the shadow of Venetian merchants, Mediterranean ports, and long chains of exchange invisible to most diners. Even ordinary people touched wider networks through small things. Salted herring from far coasts, cloth sacks from elsewhere, iron knives from another town. The medieval kitchen was local, but never entirely local. Empire could arrive disguised as seasoning. And then there were fairs larger, louder, more temporary than ordinary market days. A fair meant movement, traders from farther away, unusual goods, traveling performers, temporary excitement, and often a brief sense that ordinary life had become wider. Kitchens responded to fairs too. Visitors had to be fed, inns filled, prices shifted, opportunity and risk arrived together. Children remembered fair food, adults remembered fair prices, and everyone remembered if something went wrong. Because markets were also places of rumor. Who had a bad harvest? Which lord was demanding more rent? Where soldiers had been seen? Whether plague had reached the next town? Whether grain prices would rise again? Before newspapers, the market was one of the loudest information systems in daily life. The kitchen listened carefully. A woman returning from market did not bring back only onions. She brought news. News shaped decisions. Should grain be bought now? Should a pig be sold early? Should a daughter be sent to relatives if sickness was spreading nearby? Domestic planning depended on public conversation. History entered homes through market gossip as often as through official decree. This also made markets morally complicated. Sermons warned against greed, dishonest measures, hoarding during shortages, unfair pricing, and the temptation to profit from hunger. Yet survival itself often required difficult choices. If grain prices were rising, should a household sell now for better money or hold for fear of worse scarcity later? Morality became practical very quickly. People judged one another, but they also understood pressure. The medieval kitchen lived inside that tension, between charity and prudence, generosity and fear, hospitality and self-protection. A family could be both kind and afraid. That contradiction feels very modern. Guilds added another layer, especially in towns. Bakers, butchers, brewers, and other food trades were often organized through guild systems that regulated training, standards, competition, and civic identity. These were not only economic groups. They shaped status and belonging. A respected baker was part of the town's moral structure. A dishonest brewer could damage more than customers. The kitchen once again extended into institutions. Even ovens became political. Who had the right to bake, where, and under whose authority could involve manorial rights, urban rules, taxes, and resentment. In some villages, people were expected to use the Lord's oven and pay for it, much like the Lord's mill. This was efficient from one angle and infuriating from another. Dependence often looks orderly to the powerful. To everyone else, it feels expensive. The emotional life of bread runs through medieval history more than many wars do. Because hunger is immediate, and authority is easiest to judge when standing beside an empty shelf. This is why rebellion so often smells like grain. People might tolerate many injustices for a long time, but bread shortages made politics physical. A hungry child transformed theory into urgency. A dishonest tax on flour became unforgettable. The kitchen radicalized people before speeches did. And still, ordinary days continued. Most market visits were not dramatic. They were practical, repetitive, and full of small expertise. Knowing which butcher sold honestly. Knowing which fish was safe later in the day. knowing when to buy before rain changed prices, knowing who might quietly extend credit. These were forms of intelligence rarely celebrated, but essential. A household survived through them. This is especially important when thinking about medieval women, whose economic intelligence often operated in these spaces without becoming formal power. Managing kitchens meant managing networks, neighbors, sellers, seasonal memory, debt, reciprocity. Power does not always wear official clothing. Sometimes it carries a basket. And if the market was where food entered the household, there was still one final transformation left. The moment raw goods crossed the threshold and became something edible, shareable, and meaningful again. Because buying food was only half the work. The real test began when the door closed, the basket was set down, and the kitchen had to turn uncertainty into supper. Because that transformation, from ingredients to an actual meal, was where all the invisible skill of the medieval kitchen finally revealed itself. A basket of grain, onions, salted fish, a little cheese, perhaps some cabbage, a handful of herbs, and yesterday's bread did not look like abundance. But in practiced hands, it became the difference between a household feeling poor and a household feeling steady. Cooking was not simply preparation. It was interpretation. The cook had to read the day. How much fuel was left? Who was coming to eat? Was someone ill? Had the weather turned colder? Did the Lord expect guests? Had the children already eaten in the field? Was Lent approaching? Was there enough ale left to spare for tonight? Every meal was shaped by circumstances beyond the recipe. This is why medieval kitchens often favored dishes that modern viewers dismiss too quickly. Pottage, broths, stews, porridges, thick soups, slow-cooked mixtures that seem repetitive on paper. But these were not signs of culinary laziness. They were brilliantly practical. A pottage could absorb almost anything. Grain, beans, onions, cabbage, scraps of meat, herbs, old bread, root vegetables, leftover broth. Everything could be extended, softened, flavored, and made filling. Stayed warm. Stretched expensive ingredients. It forgave irregular timing. It was the architecture of ordinary survival. A pot might sit near the fire for hours, changing slowly as the day moved around it. Something added in the morning met something brought back from the garden at noon, and perhaps a small gift of fat or meat by evening. The meal evolved with the household. There was intelligence in that flexibility. Modern kitchens often separate meals sharply: breakfast, lunch, dinner, each with fixed expectations. Medieval households were often more fluid. A simmering pot allowed adaptation. It accepted uncertainty because uncertainty was normal, and it accepted leftovers without embarrassment. Yesterday's bread became today's thickener. Bones became broth. Fat became flavor. Nothing was wasted because waste was expensive. This made taste itself different. People today sometimes imagine medieval food as blunt and heavy, but much of its complexity came from layering necessity rather than chasing novelty. Onion sweetness, leek sharpness, parsley brightness, sage, thyme, mustard, vinegar, ale, garlic where region allowed. Flavor mattered because monotony needed interruption. Even poor households cared about taste. Pleasure was not reserved for the rich, though of course the rich had more room for it. Elite kitchens played with texture, color, spice, and display in ways that ordinary homes could not. Sauces thickened with almonds, imported spices blended into meat dishes, pastries enclosing elaborate fillings, fish prepared to imitate other creatures for entertainment at the table. Culinary performance itself became status. A feast could include surprise as a form of prestige. But even there, the fundamentals remained practical. Spices were expensive partly because they traveled far, but also because they preserved status. They marked distance from ordinary life. A heavily seasoned noble dish announced access to networks of trade and money. Pepper was flavor, yes, But it was also social architecture. And then there was bread again, always bread. No matter how elaborate the feast, bread remained central. Its quality said everything. Dark coarse bread for the poor, lighter refined loaves for the wealthy, white bread as visible privilege. The color of bread was a class system you could taste. White flour required more labor and better grain. It represented refinement in both the literal and social sense. To eat it regularly was not simply preference. It was evidence. Meanwhile, darker breads, rye, barley, oats mixed in depending on region, were durable, practical, and deeply tied to ordinary life. People knew what kind of bread belonged to whom, and ovens shaped this world. Baking bread was a serious event, not a casual daily hobby in every household. Ovens took fuel, planning, and often cooperation. Some families baked in batches. Others relied on communal ovens. Timing mattered. Heat had to be judged without modern controls. Too cool and the loaf failed. Too hot, and precious flour burned into disappointment. The baker's knowledge was physical. You learned it in your skin. Hands near the oven, eyes on the crust. Experience passed from older women to younger ones, from masters to apprentices, from repetition rather than instruction manuals. This is why written recipes from the period can feel strangely incomplete to modern readers. They assume the body already knows. Bake until done was not laziness. It was trust in shared knowledge. The same was true for roasting. Turning a spit over open flame was repetitive and exhausting. In larger households, lower-ranking servants or children might spend hours doing it, especially during feasts. Uneven heat meant constant attention. Fat dripped. Smoke shifted. Fire demanded patience. Roasted meat looked effortless only when it arrived at the table. Before that, it was labor and sweat. And then there was the scullery afterward. History likes the banquet. It forgets the washing. Greasy pots, wooden trenchers, knives needing cleaning, rushes on the floor needing replacement, scraps to sort, bones to save, ashes to carry, tables to clear, surfaces to scrub before vermin or smell took hold. The meal did not end when the eating stopped. Someone stayed behind, usually several someones. This is one of the quiet moral truths of the kitchen. Comfort is often built on invisible labor. Medieval households knew this more openly than we do because the labor was harder to hide. You could hear it in the next room. You could smell it. You could watch servants still working while others were already warm by the fire. And because work remained visible, gratitude and resentment both attached to it. A respected cook could become beloved. A careless one could become a household complaint for years. People remembered who fed them well. Food attached memory to personality. Think of childhood again. Many people's strongest emotional memories, even now, are tied not to formal events, but to repeated meals. Soup when ill. Bread after returning cold from outside. A certain dish on winter evenings. The medieval world was no different. Memory sat in repetition. This is part of why kitchens appear so often in folklore and storytelling. Not because they were glamorous, but because they were emotionally central. Witches were imagined there. Grandmothers were remembered there. Secrets were whispered there after others had gone to sleep. The hearth was practical, but it was also symbolic. It represented continuity. To keep the hearth was not just to maintain fire. It meant preserving the household itself. This symbolic power appears clearly in marriage. A bride entering a new household was not only joining a family, she was entering its rhythms of food, labor, expectation, and domestic judgment. Learning a new kitchen could mean learning a new identity. Marriage was partly culinary adaptation, which sounds smaller than it is, because to manage food was to manage peace. A badly run kitchen created daily tension. A well-run one made ordinary life feel possible. Domestic harmony often depended less on romance than on whether the bread arrived, the stores lasted, and winter did not feel like punishment. Love has many forms. Sometimes it looks like remembering there is enough soup left for tomorrow. And yet kitchens also carried ambition. Young servants hoped to rise. Apprentices hoped to become trusted craftsmen. Brewers wanted reputation. Bakers wanted customers who returned. Domestic skill could become livelihood, and livelihood could become independence. For women especially, food knowledge sometimes offered one of the few practical forms of recognized expertise available in ordinary life. Midwives, healers, brewers, dairy workers, experienced household managers, these roles overlapped with kitchen intelligence. Herbs for flavor and herbs for healing were often neighbors. The same hands that made broth might prepare remedies. This blurred the boundary between medicine and cooking in ways modern categories forget. A kitchen shelf could hold both dinner and treatment. Honey, vinegar, garlic, herbs, broth, wine. These moved easily between nourishment and remedy. To feed someone was often to try to heal them, and sometimes healing failed. A kitchen during serious illness could become painfully quiet. The pot still simmered, but appetite disappeared. Broth returned untouched. Bread remained uneaten. The ordinary signs of life shifted. Families noticed this before priests did. The kitchen measured decline. It also measured recovery. The first request for real food after illness, a little bread, stronger broth, a taste of cheese, could feel like victory. Survival often announced itself through appetite. Again, the kitchen knew first. This constant intimacy with the body, with hunger, weakness, labor, comfort, sickness, made medieval kitchens psychologically powerful places. They were where people encountered the limits of control. You could work carefully and still lose the harvest. You could preserve well and still face winter scarcity. You could cook lovingly and still watch illness take someone. The kitchen taught humility because nature always had the final word. And perhaps that is why so many medieval people treated food with a seriousness modern abundance sometimes forgets. Meals were not merely consumption. They were evidence that many fragile things had gone right. The grain had survived. The fire had held. The weather had not destroyed everything. The people had made it through another day. A bowl of stew could carry all of that silently. Which means that if we really ask why medieval kitchens were hotter, dirtier, and harder than we think, the answer is not only smoke or labor or fire. It is that the kitchen was where survival became visible every single day. And nowhere was that visibility more powerful than on the mornings when the fire had gone out overnight, and someone had to begin again from cold ash. Because a cold hearth in the morning was never just a cold hearth. It was a small domestic failure with surprisingly large consequences. Before breakfast, before field work, before servants moved through the hall or children began their tasks, someone had to restore the center of the house. If the fire had survived the night beneath its layer of ash, the day began with relief. If it had died completely, the morning changed shape. Starting a new fire took time, patience, and often frustration. Dry tinder mattered. Kindling mattered. Weather mattered. Damp wood could turn a simple task into a miserable one. Smoke might fill the room before flame properly caught. Fingers stiff with cold worked slower. Everyone waiting for warmth felt the delay. Modern inconvenience lasts minutes. Medieval inconvenience often shaped the entire day. This is one reason people guarded embers so carefully. Banking the fire overnight was not laziness. It was insurance. Ash insulated heat, preserving a living center under what looked like gray stillness. In the morning, stirring it back to life felt almost like recovering continuity itself. The house was breathing again. And if that failed, Neighbors sometimes became part of the solution. Borrowing fire was an ordinary act. Someone crossed the lane with a small container, a shovel of coals, or a carefully protected ember from another hearth. It sounds simple, but it reveals something larger. No household was entirely self-contained. Survival was communal. You might borrow yeast, salt, a little flour, a candle, a pot, or flame itself. Domestic life depended on these small exchanges more than formal histories usually notice. People who fought still borrowed fire. People who gossiped still shared embers. Necessity softened pride. This also meant the kitchen was part of neighborhood politics. A generous household built quiet loyalty. A difficult one built memory. Social reputation was often made through repeated small acts, not grand gestures. Who helped in winter mattered. Who did not mattered longer. And once the fire returned, the day's first calculations began again. What should be cooked first? Porridge for workers heading out early? Bread reheated from yesterday? Broth for someone still weak from illness? Ale warmed slightly in cold weather? Food followed need, and need changed constantly. Morning meals were usually functional. This is important because modern imagination often searches for ceremony where medieval life offered routine. For many ordinary people, breakfast was not a leisurely table but something warm enough to support labor ahead. Oats, bread, weak ale, leftovers from the previous evening, fuel, more than performance. The kitchen respected work before appetite. And then came bread management, a daily form of quiet strategy. Fresh bread was ideal but not constant. Households balanced new loaves against old ones, deciding what could be softened into soup, what must be eaten first, what should be saved for guests, what could be trusted another day. Stale bread was not failure. It was part of the system. In fact, much of medieval cooking assumed yesterday's bread would remain useful. Thickening pottage, soaking in broth, forming the base of simpler meals, bread moved through time rather than being judged by immediate freshness. Waste belonged to the foolish or the very rich. Most people were neither. This practical attitude extended to nearly everything. Animal fat was saved carefully. Dripping from roasted meat became cooking material later. Bones flavored broth until they had given everything possible. Vegetable tops, onion skins, herb stems, all were judged for usefulness before being discarded. The medieval kitchen asked one constant question: can this still serve? It is a different philosophy from modern abundance, and it shaped the physical room itself. Kitchen floors were often imperfect spaces, stone if wealth allowed, packed earth in humbler homes, sometimes covered with rushes that absorbed spills, dirt, and ordinary domestic life. These rushes were replaced, but not as often as modern comfort might prefer. This contributed to the famous smell of medieval interiors. Not simply filth, but layers of living. Ash, grease, damp straw, herbs, smoke, old ale, wet boots, dogs near the fire, spilled broth, drying clothes, onions hanging from beams. Cleanliness existed, but it existed within material limits. The goal was management, not sterility. This matters because people sometimes imagine medieval life as carelessly dirty, as though no one noticed discomfort. In truth, people noticed it constantly. They simply did not possess the same tools to erase it. A good housekeeper was respected precisely because cleanliness was difficult. Sweeping mattered. Scrubbing mattered. Airing bedding mattered. Covering food mattered. Protecting stores from rats mattered. Cleanliness was labor, not default. And because it was labor, it reflected status. A wealthy household could assign more hands to maintenance. A poor family often lived inside the compromise between what should be done and what there was time to do. Again, class shaped comfort. Even fuel changed social experience. Wood was not equal wood. Different trees burned differently. Some produced hotter fires, some longer-lasting embers, some too much smoke, some sparks dangerous enough to be feared indoors. Peat, where available, changed smell and heat. Charcoal offered advantages but cost more. People knew fuel intimately. They could tell quality by weight, sound, even by how the flame behaved. A good cook understood fire not as one thing, but as a language of materials. That knowledge rarely entered written history because it was assumed. Like so much domestic expertise, it was invisible until absent. A poorly managed fire could ruin a meal, waste resources, or start disaster. A well-managed one made everything else feel easier. Competence often looked like calm because the crisis had been prevented before anyone else noticed. This is true of kitchen authority generally. The best household managers were often remembered not for drama, but for the absence of it. Meals arrived. Stores lasted. Winter passed without humiliation. Guests were fed properly. Children grew. Illness was met with preparation rather than panic. Order itself became a form of success. That kind of success rarely receives statues, but it built civilizations. And in larger kitchens, especially in castles and monasteries, this order required astonishing coordination. The popular image of medieval grandeur often focuses on banners and stone walls, but the real test of power was frequently whether hundreds of people could be fed without collapse. Large households were logistical organisms. Grain had to be tracked, salted meat counted, fish scheduled around fasting days, ale brewed in predictable cycles, bread baked at scale, servants supervised, waste monitored, theft quietly suspected. A lord who could not feed his household looked weak. A monastery that mismanaged food threatened discipline itself. The kitchen was administration wearing an apron. There were also emotional hierarchies inside these spaces. Young servants learned fear quickly. The fear of burning the bread, of dropping a platter before guests, of misjudging the cook's instructions, of being blamed for missing stores. Domestic service could be stable, but it was rarely gentle. Authority was often sharp. Yet mentorship existed too. Older servants taught survival skills. Experienced cooks passed on techniques impossible to learn from formal instruction. A kitchen could be punishing and protective at once. Like families, it depended on who held power. And power could shift strangely. The person with least public status might possess the most practical knowledge. A noble guest could command a room but know nothing about how to keep winter cabbage edible. A senior cook might never sit at the high table yet quietly determine whether that table functioned at all. Competence created hidden authority. This is one reason kitchens fascinate historians now. They expose the people formal chronicles tried to ignore. Not because those people were secretly rulers, but because ordinary systems collapse without them. History from below often smells like onions. And perhaps the strongest proof of that comes during celebrations that went wrong. A feast remembered for burned meat. A wedding mocked for poor ale. A noble visit embarrassed by shortage. These failures lingered because food was reputation made edible. People forgot speeches faster than they forgot bad bread. Hospitality created social memory. That memory could be kind, too. A household known for generous winter meals, for good soup during illness, for feeding travelers honestly, for never letting neighbors leave hungry. These reputations outlasted wealth. People trusted kitchens before they trusted promises. This trust extended even into death. Funeral meals, mourning gatherings, food brought to grieving households. Eating remained part of loss. The kitchen did not stop because someone had died. In some ways, it became more important. People still needed feeding. Ritual required structure. Community expressed care through bread and broth before words felt useful. Grief sat beside the hearth like everything else. This may be the deepest reason the medieval kitchen matters. It was not simply where people cooked. It was where life refused to pause. Birth, illness, marriage, hunger, guests, arguments, winter, celebration, mourning. The kitchen continued through all of it. It was history's least glamorous room and perhaps its most honest one. Because behind every king, every monastery, every merchant road, every village tax dispute, every grand hall and cathedral, someone still had to wake before dawn and decide how to turn limited things into another survivable day. And often, that day began with hands in cold ash, searching for the smallest remaining sign of heat. And that small remaining sign of heat was often the difference between order and disorder. A single ember meant continuity. It meant breakfast would happen sooner, the children would leave warmer, the servants would move faster, the bread might be ready on time, and the entire invisible machine of the household could begin without unnecessary delay. It is easy to underestimate how much of medieval life depended on preventing small failures from becoming large ones. The kitchen was where that prevention happened, not through dramatic heroics, but through repetition. Checking stores, watching weather, preserving fat, drying herbs, repairing a pot handle, turning grain before damp ruined it, noticing a weak chicken before it became a lost meal, seeing smoke move strangely before fire became disaster. Most domestic intelligence was simply attention, and attention is tiring. This is especially important when we think about the emotional experience of medieval kitchens. The physical labor was obvious, but the mental labor was just as constant. Someone was always carrying the household in their mind. How much salt remained? Would the apples last? Was there enough flour for guests expected after market day? Should the better cheese be saved for Sunday? Had the roof leak near the grain sacks truly been fixed? These questions did not arrive once. They lived in the background of every ordinary day. Modern life calls this planning. The medieval household called it survival. And because so much of that planning was repetitive, it rarely looked impressive from the outside. It looked like habit. But habit was infrastructure. A household with good habits felt wealthier than it was. A household without them could feel poor even with resources. This is one reason experienced household managers were so valued. Prudence was not a personality trait. It was protection against humiliation. Running out of bread before the next baking day was not merely inconvenient. It could become public embarrassment. Neighbors noticed. Servants talked. Markets remembered. The kitchen had social consequences. This was especially true for hospitality. An unexpected guest was not unusual in the medieval world. Travelers, priests, relatives, local officials, neighbors needing help. People arrived, and the household had to respond. Refusing food too sharply could damage reputation. Offering too much could threaten reserves. Hospitality required balance. A good host made generosity look effortless, even when it absolutely was not. This is another place where women's labor often disappeared behind male reputation. A man praised for a welcoming house was often being praised for someone else's calculations. Someone had stretched the stores, planned ahead, and quietly protected abundance from becoming waste. Reputation sat on invisible work. And sometimes that work failed for reasons no one could control. Weather could undo months of good management. A late frost could kill fruit. Too much rain could spoil grain. A disease among pigs could erase expected winter meat. A flood could damage mills. Even the best kitchen could not out-organize nature forever. This created a worldview built around humility. People worked hard not because they believed control was guaranteed, but because they knew it was not. Prudence was a conversation with uncertainty. Perhaps this is why gratitude around food carried such seriousness. Blessing the meal was not empty ritual. It acknowledged fragility. Bread on the table meant many things had gone right. Harvest, weather, labor, health, luck, community, survival, all sat quietly inside that loaf. People understood this without needing philosophy. They could feel it, and because food carried moral weight, fasting carried meaning too. Religious fasting in the medieval world was not merely dietary inconvenience. It structured time, discipline, and identity. Lent, Fridays, Saints' Days, and other observances changed what kitchens produced and what tables expected. No meat from four-legged animals on certain days did not mean less work. Often it meant more. Fish had to be sourced, preserved, or purchased. Different recipes were needed. Wealthy households, especially, had to maintain visible observance without appearing deprived. The result could be remarkably elaborate fasting meals that were technically obedient while practically luxurious. Human beings have always been creative around rules. Monasteries became particularly skilled at this balancing act. Their kitchens had to support discipline without chaos. Feeding large religious communities meant combining efficiency with moral structure. Meals were often plain by design, but never casual. Order mattered. The kitchen enforced values, and values could be tasted. Even ordinary villagers experienced this rhythm. The calendar moved through the stomach as much as through the church bells. Feast days and fasting days gave emotional shape to the year. Children learned religion partly by noticing what disappeared from the table and what returned. Faith had flavor. This also reminds us that medieval kitchens were deeply seasonal in spirit, not just supply. Modern life often tries to erase seasons. Strawberries in winter, imported food on demand, climate-controlled kitchens. Medieval people lived much closer to agricultural time. You knew what month it was by what the kitchen smelled like. Spring meant fragile greens and relief. Summer meant speed against spoilage. Autumn meant preservation and urgency. Winter meant patience and dependence on what had already been secured. Season was not decoration. It was authority. This made anticipation stronger. The first fresh butter after scarcity, the first good apples, the first rich broth after illness, the return of certain feast foods. These were emotional events because absence had given them value. Abundance feels different when it is not guaranteed. And this shaped generosity too. A gift of food could carry enormous meaning. Eggs brought to a recovering neighbor, fresh bread to a new mother, preserved meat shared after slaughter, herbs passed across a fence, ale offered to a worker who had helped with harvest. These gestures built community more reliably than speeches. The kitchen was diplomacy at human scale. Most people did not negotiate treaties. They exchanged soup. This is why kitchens often stood at the emotional center of villages. They were not only places of work, but places where obligation was remembered. Who helped during winter, who sent food during illness, who never shared, who always did. Reputation tasted like memory, and memory could be long. A family known for meanness might carry that judgment for years. A household known for generosity could survive harder times because neighbors remembered previous kindness. Social credit often looked like bread. This also helps explain why theft from kitchens could feel so personal. Stealing food was not simply stealing property. It was touching the household's fragile center. Missing flour, disappearing eggs, stolen salted meat. These were violations of trust because they threatened planning itself. Suspicion entered quickly. In large households, servants were watched for this reason. In villages, neighbors noticed unusual hunger or unusual secrecy. Theft often revealed desperation, but it also created emotional damage far beyond the value of the object. Because food was never just food. It was security. And then there were celebrations that required the kitchen to temporarily pretend security was larger than it truly was. Weddings are perhaps the clearest example. A family might spend beyond comfort for a wedding feast because public dignity mattered. Guests remembered tables. Marriages created alliances, obligations, and future reputation. A wedding meal announced competence, generosity, and seriousness. Bad food at a wedding could become local folklore. Good food could become a family legend. Again, history remembers kings. Villages remember the roast that arrived late. This may sound small, but small things structure ordinary life more powerfully than grand events. Most people in medieval Europe never met a king. They absolutely remembered whether a winter guest was fed properly. The kitchen was where moral life became visible. Even language reflected this. To keep house, to be well-ordered, to be wasteful, to be good for nothing. So many judgments were rooted in domestic competence because survival demanded it. Character was measured partly through food. This could be unfair, especially to women and servants whose failures were more visible than their successes, but it also reflected genuine stakes. Burned bread was not symbolism. It was tomorrow's hunger. And through all of this, children were learning. Not only recipes, but responsibility. They learned how adults worried by watching how adults served. They learned who mattered by who was fed first. They learned generosity through being told to carry food to a neighbor. They learned scarcity through smaller portions in bad years. The kitchen was moral education disguised as routine. Long before formal lessons, children learned what kind of people they belonged to by the habits around the hearth. That may be the most lasting power of all. Because kingdoms rise and fall, trade routes shift, castles ruin, and chronicles fade. But habits taught in kitchens can survive generations without ever being written down. How to stretch soup, how to welcome a guest, how to notice if someone has not eaten, how to save the last good piece for the person who needs it most. These are small inheritances, but civilizations are often built from them. And if we follow those inheritances far enough, we arrive at a final strange truth about the medieval kitchen. For all its smoke, labor, danger, and exhaustion, it was also one of the few places where people could create a feeling of control in a world that offered very little of it. Which is why, at the end of a long day, when the fire settled lower and the worst work was finally done, people still stayed near the hearth long after supper should have ended. Because by that hour, the kitchen had become something different. The urgency was gone for a little while. The bread was eaten, the pots were mostly cleaned, the last useful light of the day had faded, and what remained was the softer sound of embers settling into themselves. This was often the quietest truth of medieval life. Not the feast, not the famine, not the grand hall or the battlefield. Just people tired sitting near warmth. A child half asleep on a bench. Someone mending cloth by poor light. A servant finally resting after hours on aching feet. A parent staring into the fire, already thinking about tomorrow's grain, tomorrow's weather, tomorrow's work. An older voice telling the same story everyone knew, and everyone still listened to. The kitchen was not beautiful because it was easy. It was beautiful because it endured. It held smoke, burns, arguments, shortages, spilled ale, bad winters, disappointing harvests, and endless repetition. It was hotter, dirtier, and harder than most modern people would willingly tolerate. And yet it was also where comfort was made. Not purchased, made. Warmth came from labor. Meals came from labor. Celebration came from labor. Even peace inside a household often came from labor no one praised enough. That may be the deepest misunderstanding modern people have about medieval kitchens. We imagine inconvenience where medieval people experienced responsibility. We see discomfort and assume failure. But much of what looks harsh to us was simply the visible cost of keeping life going. They were not living badly because they were careless. They were living carefully inside material limits we no longer feel. The smoke-blackened beams, the rough bread, the endless pots of pottage, the preserved meat, the crowded hearth, the communal oven, the fear of winter stores running low. None of this was quaint. It was practical. It was intelligent. It was survival shaped into routine. And within that routine there was dignity. A well-kept fire in January. A loaf that rose properly after a difficult week. A guest fed honestly. A child sent to sleep warm. A neighbor given broth during illness. A wedding remembered kindly because the table felt generous. These were not small victories. They were the architecture of ordinary civilization. History often teaches us to look upward, to kings, wars, crowns, and cathedrals. But if you want to understand how most people actually lived, you have to look downward, toward the hearth, toward the ash, toward the hands that kept touching the same work, day after day, without applause. The medieval kitchen was where history stopped being abstract. It was where hunger became real, where class became visible, where religion entered the body, where politics tasted like bread, where love sometimes looked like the last good onion being saved for someone else, and where death, illness, marriage, winter, celebration, and survival all passed through the same room. It was the least glamorous room in the house, and often the most important. Perhaps that is why the memory of kitchens lasts so stubbornly across centuries. Even now, long after castles have become ruins and manor halls have turned into tourist sites, people still understand the language of a warm kitchen. They understand the smell of bread. They understand the relief of soup after cold weather. They understand that being invited to sit and eat means more than calories. Some human things survive every century, and maybe that is the final lesson here. The medieval kitchen was harder than we think because life itself was harder than we often remember. But it was also more connected. People felt the chain between labor and comfort more clearly. They knew where warmth came from. They knew what bread cost. They knew that a meal was never just a meal. It was proof. Proof that the harvest had held. Proof that winter had not won. Proof that someone had woken before dawn and made sure the day could begin. So the next time the medieval world is imagined as candlelight and stone walls and romantic banquets, it may be worth remembering the real center of it all. Not the throne, the hearth, not the crown, the cook, not the feast itself, but the tired hands in cold morning ash, searching carefully for one surviving ember and smiling when they found it. If that detail surprised you most, I'd love to hear it. What part of medieval kitchen life feels hardest to imagine living through today? And if you enjoy these quieter journeys into the past, stay with us. There is always another room in history waiting to be opened, and usually it begins somewhere much smaller than we expect.